And welcome back to episode 3 of the Citizens Playbook. If the Declaration was the why of America, the Constitution is the how. Today, we unpack the instruction manual and operating system of our government, focusing on the bedrock principles of separated powers, federalism, and the intentional friction. Our featured guest for episode 3 is Professor Eric Segall, the Ashe Family Chair, Professor of Law at Georgia State University College of Law. So if the Declaration of Independence was the why of America, the Constitution is the how. It's the instruction manual, it's the operating system for the entire U.S. government, and it all starts with 3 of the most powerful words ever written: we the people. Welcome back to Citizens Playbook. I'm Joe Henning.
And I'm Judge Stephen Knights Jr., and today we're exploring the framework of our government. To help us, we're joined by Professor Eric Segall from Georgia State University College of Law. Professor, welcome, sir.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate what you guys are trying to do.
These have been some great conversations that we've been having, and I can't thank you enough, 1, for your knowledge, but 2, for your time, and just the opportunity to spread civics awareness to Henry County and to the state as a whole. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
It's my pleasure.
Yes, sir. And Professor Segall, before we get into the Constitution itself, let's set the stage a little bit here. The first attempt at a national government under the Articles of Confederation did not work so well. Anything you wish to share on why it may have fell apart?
Sure, and I think history, we can disagree a lot about a lot of historical issues, but why we went from the Articles of Confederation to the United States Constitution is something that most historians agree on, and as usual, it has to do with money. The Articles of Confederation only created a Congress. There was no president. There was no Supreme Court. There was very little federal law. Congress did not have the power to regulate the national economy. What we now speak of as regulating commerce among the states. So what happened was each state, and this kind of makes sense probably, looked out for its own economic interests. So New York tax goods heading to New Jersey tax goods heading to Connecticut, New York and back and forth. A lot of competition between the states because there was no federal legislature to guard against that competition. And that was the main reason why the delegates went to Philadelphia to talk about writing a new constitution. And that is why 2 things happened in the new Constitution that were different than the old Constitution. Maybe 3 things. There are a lot of things. One is that we got a president and a Supreme Court, which we didn't have before, which is kind of a big deal. But more importantly, probably, Congress was given the power to regulate commerce among the states. And what that meant was Congress could stop New York from taxing New Jersey or New Jersey from taxing Connecticut or whatever it was. That was really, really super important. The other thing is the Articles of Confederation was basically a blueprint for a confederation, an alliance of 13 sovereign states. The United States Constitution is different. It is a blueprint for a government. It says that federal law is supreme. We really only became a country when the Constitution was ratified. The Articles of Confederation was kind of like a peace treaty among 13 different and separate units. And one way of showing that, last thing I'll say, is the Articles of Confederation basically said that Congress only had the powers that were expressly delegated by the Articles of Confederation, which were very few. The new Constitution, the 10th Amendment, says Congress has all the powers not delegated to the states, basically saying that Congress has all the enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8, plus any implied powers. And it is that implied powers doctrine that has led to the rise of the national government.
So thankfully, even though it might have been, I don't want to say it was a disaster, but it was a failed attempt at unification in that. But thankfully, they didn't just throw it out, that they reworked it, and now we're where we are today.
Well, no, they did throw it out. And the irony, they did. They shelved the entire Articles of Confederation and created a whole new constitution. Now, the Articles of Confederation said it took unanimity to do that, and we didn't have unanimity. But that goes to something important about our Constitution, too, even as it comes to us today, which is James Madison called these kinds of documents, constitutions and Articles of Confederation and treaties and that kind of thing. He called them parchment barriers. And what he meant by that was they're great if the people believe in them. But if the people don't believe in them, they're just pieces of paper. I think that's an important lesson we need to think about today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
So, Professor, just kind of going a little bit deeper here, the structure of our Congress, a House based on population and a Senate with 2 members per state, for example, was born of a massive compromise. If you can go ahead and tell us, how does that specific design decision still impact how laws are passed or created today?
Well, the structure of our Senate dramatically impacts who we are as a country because Wyoming and North Dakota and Rhode Island, Connecticut have the same power in the Senate as California, New York, and Texas. California, New York, and Texas has far more people. I think California has 50 times the number of people as Wyoming, or maybe more than that. And so this was a compromise. A lot of the compromises that we made in 1788 and that time period were, of course, over slavery. And this was a way of Southern states retaining power. There are other parts of the Constitution that are like that. My personal opinion, that's all it is a personal opinion, is that this idea, and by the way, the only provision in the Constitution that the Constitution says can't be changed with the constitutional amendment process is 2 senators from every state. To me, that harkens more to an Articles of Confederation idea than a country idea, because it's crazy to say that a few million people in Wyoming have the same power as 50 million people in California, or whatever the California's population is. In fact, the Supreme Court has held that a fundamental principle of our democracy is one person, one vote, which suggests, for example, in the 1950s, when rural counties throughout the South carried much more weight and had many more representatives than urban cities, the court in Reynolds versus Sims said no, one person, one vote. If Nashville has 100,000 people and a rural county has 10,000 people, they both can't get one representative. Nashville should have more representatives for 100,000 people than a rural county with 10,000 people. So that one person, one vote rule is something the Supreme Court thought was fundamental to our system. Of course, the court, I like that rule, but the court just made it up because there's nothing in the Constitution about that. And in fact, if anything, the makeup of the Senate suggests exactly the opposite, because the makeup of the Senate is not one person, one vote.
Right.
Much of our modern day politics is directly affected by the idea that small states can stop the big states from doing what the big states want to do. And we can have a debate about that, but it is in our Constitution, and it is presumably the only part of our Constitution that can't be changed.
Wow. Well, let's talk a bit about, since we're talking Senate and House, let's talk a bit about the separation of powers and what that shows for the people listening.
So that this was an incredibly important idea to the founding fathers. James Madison, again known as the father of the Constitution, said the accumulation of all powers in one person, whether elected, hereditary, or whatever, is the very definition of tyranny. So what the founding fathers did, and this was the founding fathers had their faults. Certainly, slavery is a big one, but that doesn't mean they didn't have some good ideas as well. And this idea of separation of powers was kind of the counterintuitive idea that having more government rather than less will protect freedom, because different parts of government will check each other and form a basis of limitation on the other's powers. So that they created a system where Congress passes the laws, but the president can veto them. But we didn't want to give the president too much power, so Congress can override that veto with 2/3 of each house, which is hard to do, but it's been done. The president nominates ambassadors and Supreme Court justices and federal judges, but the Senate has to approve them. The whole idea here was that one branch of government check the other. It's also the idea behind federalism, which is that having state governments and federal government both be strong would, again, counterintuitively, would be a way to limit tyranny, because they would fight against each other and the people could choose among the two. Separation of powers was an idea that other legal theorists like Montesquieu and a couple others had thought about. But federalism, as Justice Kennedy used to say, was America's invention. And the idea that we'd have, a strong federal government and a strong state government to kind of work with each other and against each other is really one of the brilliant parts of our Constitution, and I think does, to some degree, manage the fear of tyranny. One last thing. People think of us as having separation of powers, but we also have blended powers. The whole idea here is we want the federal government to be efficient, but we don't want it to be tyrannical.
So, Professor, just to, I know you mentioned a few key concepts, but just for the listeners to break down who may not have heard any of these terms before, can you describe and explain these three concepts? First, the separation of powers. Secondly, checks and balances. And then thirdly, federalism, so that we all can be on the same page what those three key concepts mean.
Well, the first two, separation of powers and checks and balances, I think are the same. And the idea is we have three branches of the federal government. They all have different responsibilities, but some shared responsibilities. And the idea is that if the Congress gets too strong, the president will check it. If the president gets too strong, the Congress will check it. If the president and Congress both do things that are unconstitutional, the Supreme Court is there to stand in. So Congress says, let's solve air pollution. But Congress doesn't know how to do that. So it says to the executive branch, hire some experts and fix air pollution. Or, figure out how to deal with AI. Well, we're not the experts, you're the expert. But the idea is the three branches of the federal government would check each other while working together also to have some form of efficiency. Federalism is the same idea as applied vertically to the federal government and the states. Now, valid federal laws are supreme over inconsistent state laws. The Supremacy Clause says that. But what is a valid federal law is often up for doubt. But the idea here is we want people to have both a local government and a national government to hold accountable and to decide during elections if we're happy with what the leaders have done. And again, having two governments will protect tyranny more than having one government because, as Madison said, the accumulation of all powers in one hand is the very definition of tyranny.
And Professor, we appreciate that explanation. I just want to just follow up briefly. When you combined, as mentioned, the separation of powers and checks and balances, as the analysis you gave, that may seem maybe cumbersome to the average citizen or listener. Can you explain what the founding fathers may have originally had in mind when they designed that government? Was there a certain type of friction that was built in there, or what was the design in your
Well, when you
understanding?
ask me what the founding fathers had in mind, as a critic of the legal theory of originalism, which is that we should solve problems today by looking back 2 centuries, when you ask me what they had in mind on most important issues, they disagreed, just like we disagree on most important issues. So I'm reluctant to get into a conversation about what they had in mind. As a general proposition, I think they all agreed with some very large principles that don't tell us anything about individual cases. But these large principles are we need to have three independent, strong branches of the federal government. We need to have a strong set of state governments to offset the possibility of tyranny at the federal level. We have to give them enough tools to work together to pass laws for efficiency's sake, to regulate a national economy, to not go back to a world where New York is taxing New Jersey, and New Jersey is taxing Connecticut, and so on and so forth. But as applied to any particular modern day case, broad principles of separation of powers and checks and balances don't tell us how to decide individual cases. But the real idea here is to have three branches of the federal government that will both work together to do the right things and check each other with checks and balances when they do the wrong things.
So really, it is a safety feature. It's
It's
meant to.
absolutely a safety feature.
Yeah.
Remember, but the overriding interest of the white propertied males who formed this country were to get away from the oppression of taxation without representation and the oppression of King George III. And they wanted to create King George, and they wanted to create a system of government that was unlike the tyranny they thought they were under and probably were under, with parliamentary supremacy and the idea the king can do no wrong. So the avoidance of tyranny was probably the most important factor underlying our new Constitution, along with giving the Congress the tools to regulate a national.
Thank you.
Professor, if you want to just touch a little bit on, we didn't speak on the supremacy clause in Article 6 in depth. If you want to
Sure.
just maybe touch on that briefly for our listeners.
Article 6 doesn't get litigated very often because it's very clear. It says the laws of the United States passed pursuant to the Constitution shall be supreme, and judges in every state have to obey them, notwithstanding state law. Where there is a valid federal law, it is supreme, and state law that is inconsistent with that valid federal law must give way. But again, we have to decide if something's a valid federal law, and unlike state governments, which can do anything the Constitution doesn't forbid, the Congress can only act when it acts pursuant to one of the powers given to it by the Constitution. Now, it turns out one of those powers is to regulate commerce among the states, which in a interconnected international world of economic units means Congress has tremendous power because almost everything affects commerce among the states. But that's just how history has played out.
Super. Super. This has been an eye opener. It's been a master class. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I think, Professor, really the takeaway is that this framework for the Constitution was designed to balance that power, but to also protect that freedom that we so badly wanted at that time. with the tyranny that they were being experiencing.
Well, it protected the freedom of some of subsets of the population. The idea was to form a country that, in 1803, the court decided Marbury versus Madison, which is the case that kind of gives us the rationale for judges striking down laws. It's 1803, it's only 15 years or so after the Constitution was ratified. But in that opinion, which can be criticized on many levels, there is a paragraph that is not criticizable. That is one of the great paragraphs, I think, written in any literature forever, where Justice Marshall basically says that where we suffer legal injuries, we deserve redress in court for the violation of those injuries because we are a government of men, let's call it people, a government of people, not law. A government of laws, not people. Excuse me.
Hmm.
Government of laws, he said not men, but government of laws, not people. That idea that laws bind our elected leaders, and if the elected leaders injure us through the violation of laws, we have to go to a court and seek redress, is, what distinguishes a free country from a not free country to some significant degree. And although their understanding of who would get the benefit of all that was limited, the general idea was brilliant, of course. We're a government of laws, not people. And I think the United States continues to strive to be that. And it's as Martin Luther King would have said, there's a little bit forward, a little bit back, a little bit forward, a little bit back. Hopefully we bend towards greater equality over time. But if we do that, it's because of the people in this country, not because of a document that's under a glass
Yeah,
in Washington, D.C. we call the Constitution.
absolutely.
Well, Professor Segall, thank you for your vast knowledge here and, just sharing all that wealth of information to the listeners here. It's time for extra credit for our listeners.
Okay.
Here it is. Civics homework. Look up Article 5. This is the article that explains how the United States Constitution may be amended, understanding how difficult it may be to change any documents from such a long time. That's your assignment going forward. And I'll turn it over to you at this time here, Joe. And thank you again, Professor.
Professor, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I appreciate your wisdom. And as I've said before, I enjoy following you on social media and that just to see what your take is on so many things. So I appreciate your time today. And next episode, we'll be back to discuss the grand bargain that was required to get this Constitution approved. And we're talking about your personal shield against the government, the Bill of Rights. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Citizens Playbook. We want to take a quick moment to extend a special thank you to Georgia Power for their generous support of this entire series. Georgia Power's commitment to our communities goes far beyond delivering reliable energy. They are actively investing in an informed, engaged, and empowered Georgia. Their partnership is what helps us bring these critical civic conversations right to your headphones. We are incredibly grateful for their support. Our deepest thanks to Professor Eric Segall for giving us a masterclass on the Constitution and for his brilliant work at the Georgia State University College of Law. Don't keep this operating manual to yourself. Share this episode with someone who wants to understand how the architecture of our government truly functions. And next week, we look at your personal shield, the Bill of Rights. The Citizens Playbook is hosted by Joseph Henning and State Judge Stephen Knights Jr., produced by Trinity Archer. This has been a Henry Chamber Media production, copyright 2026.